towards the stage because it is my absolute delight to introduce you to our writer at work, the guy who will make your beloved fortnight look just aight. Grady Chambers, the master of meter, the sultan of the sonnet, OG of the ode, the Thanos of the tercet, our John Wick of the limerick. Grady, whoa, hey, Grady is bar none, one of the most recognized and accomplished young poets in the entire country. Last summer, he won the absolute top cash money prize for a first book of poetry. And speaking of top prizes, Grady is the recipient of a Stegner Fellowship, meaning Stanford paid him to attend their prestigious institution. Imagine if colleges paid you 50 G's a year to attend. And that's how good Grady is. And we are very lucky to have him with us here today. Please give him a warm welcome.
I feel like to live up to that introduction, I'd have to come out here with like a title belt or something like that. And I didn't realize it was going to be with such vigor and energy. But Mr. Kingsley, thank you so much. It's really awesome to be here, and it's a privilege to get to read to you guys today and to get to meet some of you in Mr. Kingsley's class this afternoon. I know probably some of you guys know his work. Some of you get to be in class with him, but for the rest of you, you probably just only know him as a teacher here. My advice is Google this dude and read some of his poetry because he's really a rock star. He's going to be around for a long time to come and widely read. So thank you, Mr. Kingsley, and thanks to the Tickner Center for bringing me. It's a really cool thing to be here. So I'm going to read some poems today from my first book, which is coming out next month. The book is called North American Stadiums. Maybe unsurprisingly, given that title, I watch a lot of sports, so sports make their way into a lot of the poems. It's also a book about memory and I think history as well, on both a large and small scale. Histories of landscapes and cities, histories of families, histories of relationships, and then small things down to the history of a jacket. So. But I guess the other thing is that I grew up in Chicago, spent a lot of time in the Midwest, and have lived for the last 10 years or so in the Northeast. So those landscapes factor in heavily into my poems. So this first one is called Syracuse, October. Forget the hot autumns of Charleston. Forget handsome Alabama. Forget the deep South alcoholics standing in flannel in the summer sun. I drove north. I took Green Road to Hubbardsville and saw October and August, booted men hosing grit off the park pool's bottom, crisp leaves lifted like the remnants of summer's collective memory. I drove out or into it, listening to the Liverpool Choir's mournful version of the national anthem, the tuning forks of eastern townships, bringing a Stravinsky more film score than symphony. I wanted the blaze of the unmuffled trumpet, the spin song of the laundromat, a little of the hurricane's Guernican remedy in the streeted leaves, in the blooms of glass from kids breaking fluorescent light tubes in the spent vocabulary of an asphalt parking lot. I wanted October. Lace trim of a black dress slumped on the floor of my birthday, cold skin and laughter. Little burn on the leaves, little love declaration, little dull light in the white sky. This next poem is called Another Beauty I Remember. It's about when I was in high school, a friend of mine's grandparents lived up on Lake Michigan, on the Michigan-Indiana border. So my buddies and I would try as much as possible to drive up there on the weekends. There's some a little bit of bad behavior in the poem, I guess, but it's called Another Beauty I Remember. Somewhere in South Chicago, the millwrights and welders of U.S. Steel are leaving their masks to hooks and lockers and shining out into evening still covered in dust. Those men do not belong to me, their world of arc and fire, though many nights I have loved them. When I was 17, my friends and I rode each weekend toward the Indiana border. One drove, another worked the dials on the radio, and I drank gin in the back and ordered us to slow over the toll bridge to peer down at the barge lights roaming the Calumet River, then up to where the smokestacks of U.S. Steel rose like an organ in a church. Gin, fire, the workers coming off their shifts, light lighting up the metal dust spread along their shoulders like the men had all walked through plate glass windows. Their dust does not belong to me, but many nights I have loved them. They do not live where I was born, north of the mammoth glass residences of the Gold Coast, where the worst news was soon mended. A neighbor girl's bone broken in a fall, a garage fire sullying the air over Broadway and Balmoral. I did not know their sons. The Burns, the Walshes, the Manseckis of Bridgeport and Fuller Park, the Green Parade and the Green River and the pride of the Irish, laughter, bright balloons over cracked asphalt, yellow hair in sunlight, all the families singing songs of another country. I keep taking the long road back to that summer because the image won't leave me. Weekend evenings, gin and driving south, smoke blasting from the factory stacks, the men glancing up at the flash of our passing. We were going to spend all night drinking gin on an Indiana beach. Dust had settled like fragments of a hand grenade, like silver wings across the backs of the men. We were going to tell each other what was beautiful. The dark water was beautiful, the fire drowning the air with smoke, our voices drowned by the sound. I stood at the edge of the water where the coastline stretched from my left and curved enough north that the stitch of factory lights looked like they were shining from the far side of the lake. We burned traces into the air with the burning tips of sticks poked into the heart of fire. We all said the sky was beautiful, our bodies light against the water. Somewhere in South Chicago, the millwrights and welders of U.S. Steel are leaving their masts to hooks, and they are going home. What did I know then? What did I know of the beauty of the men? Driving past, I watched just long enough to see them stepping out of their shifts, believing them angelic, knowing not a thing about their lives. Each of them, perhaps, seeing what I saw, light coming off the backs of the others as they drifted into the lot, but knowing the light I saw was dust, not wings, and, knowing to call it dust, calling it dust. This next poem is about a good friend of mine named Michael. He was sort of a wild dude. He was one of the guys who I used to hang out with when we'd go up to Indiana, and he loved music. And what I remember, I guess the image that I remember him, in which I remember him best, was sort of plowing through a crowded living room in an old Pink Floyd t-shirt. I think it was one of the Dark Side of the Moon ones that has like the rainbow comet on it. I've been thinking a lot about him lately, and this memory that is perhaps strongest for me is of flying a kite with him when we were just real little kids. So this is for Michael. It's called Bands You Might Have Liked If You Were Still Alive. Pantera, Little King, Danzig's Lucifuge, Black Sabbath or Alice in Chains, something with bite marks and metal on the wrist. Because you laugh from the brain swell of nitrous oxide huffed from a punch balloon's flute. Because you were a bastard. Because you were brick to window, window to the undone glass along the pavement, a surprise in the softness of your sorry. Wilco for Chicago, Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, temple hymnal for the Sabbath you swapped the juice for wine and went red as a testament robe. Something Rome for a city you had never been to. Something requiem because your parents died before you. Lou Reed, Little Prince, Patricia Lee, Iggy Pop's passenger you were too young to know. dodos for the sixth song solo alone, the string sounds, the shout, the jungle drums coming back in. Like flight, Michael, like light to the lakeside sky, we were drunk, shrug, dumb enough to leap beneath, from cliff ledge to glass flat, dawn-dulled water. Our splay to pale knives falling to that blackness. Phoenix because you are ash. Waves, sunkill, the Walkman sun-washed Lisbon. Because you would forgive, Michael, these words, my sentimental and all-night drinking among friends who remember you better, loved you with a rage like blindness, the sun against an eye. Because I still don't know if you meant to leave us. Something commissioned, little king, something Philly, finally, as that's how I remember you best. Still with your kid fat, your little league tee, our hands together on the spool. November and letting it out, the kite's slow rise, the crows flying by us, how you just took over, walked off, left me at the park edge, followed that high stitch deep into the field. I think I'll read two more. This is called A Summer. In June, my dog died. By the sex shop on Belmont, a guy carried a sign with last days printed in fat black letters, and he could be forgiven for thinking so. The city was steaming. Commuters shook open their papers. Capitalism seemed to collapse, then didn't. Men howled from their jail cells all across the South. I wanted to feel real grief, and did, the way my mother lifted the dead dog off the vet's metal slab, then held it to her chest as if it were a child and merely sleeping. But driving home, she showed me the first house she lived in with my father. That night we cried, lit a candle, drank cold white wine on the dark back porch. What I mean is, it felt good to sit there. It felt like I could feel time open outward like a swimmer opens water. In July, an ex-girlfriend called about a jacket she'd never given back. We made plans. By August, I'd forgotten the sign, but remembered the man standing under the flat sky, diminished, the gray traffic passing behind him. The heat broke. August kept on going. I drove my mother to the shore, scattered the dog's ashes, dove in. And this last poem is kind of a weird one. When I was little, I really liked watching Pittsburgh Steelers football games, both because I liked watching the team, but I really liked when they'd break from commercial back to the game, they would show images of the city and all the bridges and the rivers, and it held like a great fascination for me. So I started this poem just knowing that I wanted to end it at the football stadium, and along the way sort of got really absorbed in the history of Pittsburgh, and so there's a lot of history of the city that comes into this poem. It's called Dispatch Pittsburgh. It's 1770 or 1946 or 2018, an iron city, steel city, city of coal smoke and bridges, the tongue-twisting Monongahela shifting the narrative. There was Indian dominion over the upper Ohio Valley, Sawkunk and Logstown, outposts of the Iroquois and Shawnee. There was a vision and a battle, vicious histories, the red oval of my mouth as I floated over tribal chiefs, receiving blankets from the Europeans, a scream that no one heard. I sleep on couches and turn my body to face the cushions and keep my shoes laced and gaping on the floorboards below me. So when I wake, I step straight into daylight in the city of 500 bridges and cross number 76 into 1812 to watch the smokestacks and forges spring up on the flatlands, a city formed by warfare. They called it the Westward Portal until destiny manifested itself and it became the smoky city, the typhoid capital, blooms forming from the hot rolling of ingot stock, iron ore crushed in the sinter plants, the deposits roiling the rivers to 130 degrees. In divine time, I stood with Carnegie on the gilded balcony of his East Side mansion. We toasted Clinton and Soho, whose iron furnaces brought coke fire smelting to the region. And I danced at the Battery Ball with Rockefeller's daughter. We cakewalked into a two-step, polkaed into a waltz, and I left her mid-mazurka to blitz the buffet table. I came back in 65 years to find her a skeleton frozen in a permanent twirl, her pearls glowing brightly in the ballroom lights, and I lapped at the champagne still dripping from her ribcage. But there was no time to waste. It was 1944. There was a war on, so I snatched the pearls from her neck and loaded them into my Colt Commando and marched out into the arsenal of democracy. I high-stepped to the Navy yards where tanned sailors leaned out of the portholes while their girls knelt with bent necks. It looked like praying. And I cheered the men's departure while their women wept into my shoulders, and I jeweled the night sky with my gunshots. Then I walked across the Liberty Bridge and felt the factories chip and crumble behind me, and when I reached the other side, it was 1973, my gun had rusted, and I slid across beds of shattered glass, chanting white flight, rust belt, brain drain, mercy, and knifed into the bottom of a fountain where the Allegheny joins the Monongahela, and I closed my eyes and slept for 40 years. When I woke, I was surrounded by dimes and pennies. It was 2018, just another wartime Sunday, so I shrugged and played the lotto and followed the streams of people to Heinz Field, where the Steelers lined up to play the Chiefs. And I scalped tickets in the bright light of the winter parking lot. And I told anyone who would listen they used to call this city hell with the lid off. And the crowds moved around me. I hovered above them, and everyone wore yellow sweatshirts, and the arms were stitched with black hearts and stars. Thanks a lot.
Gentlemen, we got time for like a 3 to 5 minute Q&A. If you have any questions, just stand up, shout them out.
I would say that I had sort of a kernel of interest from just reading books off my parents' shelves. When I was growing up, they were, both my parents are like ex-hippies, they were anti-war activists, and so there was a lot of like beat writers on the bookshelf. So I grew up reading like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, and just always sort of liked the rhythm of the language and the sort of overflow of it. And then, yeah, I just, when I was in college, randomly I got placed in a creative writing class because there was a writing requirement. And even though I was a political science major, I just made sure to take one creative writing class every year, and I just kept at it. And just, yeah, I mean, just kept writing, and then it, you know, yielded good things. Yeah. Wow. Probably, I think the book that I've been reading most lately is a book called What the Living Do by a woman named Marie Howe. That's one of my favorite contemporary books of poetry. And going back, Gerard Manley Hopkins is sort of my guy because of the sound of his poems. I think is pretty incredible. Yeah. Mostly, seriously, mostly those images on TV of the football stadium and the shots of the bridges and the rest of the city at the commercial break. I thought it was a beautiful city, so I wanted to write about it. I've actually never been there. We got time for one more? All right, one more question? Yeah. I write pretty much exclusively in free verse, so the contemporary unrhymed, unmetered poetry. I read a ton of older metered work. There's a British guy named Christopher Logue who I think is really excellent, and I think there's a lot to be learned from that about how to create sound and interesting sounds in a really confined, tight space. Okay. Thank you guys so much. It was really fun being here.